Hello, everyone. I'm Pamela Marshall at the Wellness Radio TV and at the Wellness Radio TV podcast. This is going to be a fascinating interview. This is Suicide Awareness Month. And my guest for this show, Jane Hartenstein, is a former professional in the mental health arena. She's taken her experiences and her curiosity about how we have handled people with mental health challenges over the ages. And she's written 3 novels. You'll be quite fascinated when you hear some of the things that she's going to talk about that we will be able to hear about based on the work that she has done. She is one of the 150 authors that will be a part of the Sunshine State Book Festival in Gainesville, Florida, January 27th and the 28th. We hope that you will be there. It's going to be at Trinity United Methodist Church. But that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Please stay with us. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like, share, and subscribe. On Sisters of Wellness, our goal is to sow into the lives of those who are watching and our next generation. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sisters of Wellness. I'm Pamela Marshall and my guest, Jane Hartenstein. She's in St. Augustine, Florida. How are you, Jane?
Oh, very well. Thank you. How are you this evening, Pam?
Doing very well. We all are bracing ourselves for this wind and rain that is inevitably headed our way. We are prayerful that it will be not as bad as they're predicting. How are you guys doing down in St. Augustine?
Very well. We're preparing as everyone else does, but again, we're Floridians. We're pretty hardcore, so we're
Yeah.
ready.
Yeah. Jane, I want to jump right into your books. What made you decide to do this? Because you worked in this profession, in administration, in public policy. Why? How did your mind switch to what? How have we handled mental illness in our country and around the world? What brought you to that point?
I was very curious about so many things. Everything from why is the layout of a hospital this way? It doesn't make sense. Why do we call people with mental illness nuts? Where do we get the term a method to their madness? So, and I've always been a history buff. So I started researching and looked at different periods of time. I looked at the laws, I looked at the medicine, and the social beliefs and mores at that time. And I wondered what would have happened if I had some of the people with schizophrenia that I knew and worked with. What would have happened if they had lived in 1100 when the Crusaders were going to Jerusalem? What would have happened to them if, with the voices that they heard, they were in 1600 in London when there was the rise of witchcraft? What would have happened to them? And when I put them back into that time and just watched what happened, it was just amazing to me. I understood a lot of why we do things the way that we do, how we got here, but it also pointed in a lot of ways to, well, maybe there's a better way.
And so, how do you get there, though? How do you come up with these characters and you put them back into this period of time? How do you develop them?
Oh, they find you. Um,
Okay.
when you when you do the research and you find out all of these little things that happened, I believe that history is a lot of little things that happen. And of course, living in St. Augustine, every time you turn the corner there's some little small aspect that is just fascinating. But it's all these little turns of history. um, and knowing the people that I did, and the illness has not changed over thousands of years. The illness of mental illness is the illness, and you put them into a different period of time. It's society who reacts differently. It is the benefit of science, whatever we have, the medicine that we have, that's what's applied at the time. The laws from that time are applied. So the people don't change. The illness doesn't change. It's society and how they handle that. That's what changed, and that's fascinating to me.
Back then, that's when the term came about for women, hysterical. Um,
Exactly.
yeah,
It goes all the way back to the Greeks.
yeah.
So when we call women hysterical, it's like, do you realize that you're really talking about, you're going back thousands of years? It's, so interesting knowing the derivation of a lot of the words. When we call people nuts, it's like that's there was in 1720 there became a new medical theory that plants, if the plant looked like the organ, that must be good. It must be cured. Well, the brain looked like a walnut. So they said, well, if someone is acting a little different, if they're hearing voices, that you must use the nut. You must make a paste and put it on their head. And we said, you need a touch of the nut. And since that time, we call people nuts. So when you understand the
That's how that came
derivation,
about.
yes, yes, and that's 1720. Yes, when that signature came about, and that's where we get wormwood, and we get a lot of our other plants are named for that too. But just to apply that to mental illness, it's just like, okay, and that's a derivate that is directly derived from a medical theory of the 1700s, and here today we still have people calling other people nuts. So
Tell me what was most surprising to you as you developed these characters and the title of the book, your book's Voices.
yeah, I this series, there are 3 books in the series, all of them about voices, because it's about people who hear voices, people with schizophrenia. Of course, there are many other different types of mental illness, and we recognize those different types today. But in particular, I was interested in schizophrenia. And in 1100, and there were actually documented cases at that point. So in my research, I could read about those folks and what was being done, not only in the West, but also in the East. In 1100, we were being severely impacted by so many of the political things that were going on in England. Of course, our Constitution based on Old English law. A lot of what we do today is based on what happened back then, as much of our Constitution is as well. But my third one was Dorothea Dix, who actually I felt heard the voice of the mentally ill. She was a woman in 1850, the last person who you would ever consider being an advocate. And her life story is just amazing. The changes that she made. I say that her life is a textbook for advocacy. She's the least likely person to have ever done what she did.
So, so who was that based on?
Dorothea Dix was a real person. Born in Maine, totally dysfunctional family, ran away from home in when she was 12 years old. This is in the early 1800s when this was just unheard of. Runs away to Boston and then becomes such an advocate for the mentally ill. She wanted to do something good with her life, and she tried teaching school, and that kind of discipline wasn't for her. But Dorothea also turns out to be a writer, and she went out and reviewed all the different she looked for all the different cases within a state and would write up this big program, and then she would present it to the state legislatures, and she would embarrassed them into providing some funding to build a hospital. She ended up building over 33 hospitals for the mentally ill. And this is in the mid 1800s.
Well, there's a formula.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is when women were not even allowed. Her first memorial to the New York State legislature, she was not allowed to present it because women were not allowed on the floor of the legislature. She had to have her friend present it. But
She
she'd
was
written
successful.
embarrassed them enough to provide the funding.
And tell our audience. So you have these series of books, and it's based on the challenges of mentally ill people. And you say the mental illness is the mental illness is hasn't changed. Have our views, have our ways of treating, how much have they shifted?
Oh, they have changed so much. But again, they have changed through the years, and they reflect the time period that they were in. We've done everything from putting people, trying to float them in water, and then in the 30s, we were using electric shock. In the 60s and 70s, we started discovering medication. We used medication. Uh, but then we also knew, we have found, and some of the other places, that supported housing has helped a great deal. The illness has not changed. It's still, these are folks who hear voices, but if with the proper treatment. And today we have medication that helps a great deal. So things, the treatment reflects the period of time that they were in. And that was what kind of fascinated me about the history of it as well.
What did you find surprising as you did your research and looking at the history of mental illness, this human disorder that's been around a long time and is not going away?
It always surprises me, the strength of the people with the illness and what they save of themselves. These are people who were gifted musically. They're very intelligent. They're great writers, poets, and they always seem to save that piece of themselves from the illness. And I saw that happening back in 1100. And I saw that in the folks that I worked with as well. They could save that musical ability. They could save that ability to write poetry. And that still amazes me, what human beings are capable of saving from an illness. And I kind of suspect that it's not just mental illness. I think people, regardless of the illness that they have, are saving some part of the person of themselves, what makes them them.
How do you see your works adding to the conversations and perhaps adding to, as the woman that you talked about, Dix, adding to changes in public policy?
I would like to think that when people read my books, they will see the people they will see them as people, not as the illness. They will identify with them. For the first time, I believe, I have people who are mentally ill who are the heroes, of novels. One of this summer, I was over in Woodstock, Vermont, and I was talking about a Dorothea Dix book. And one of the young woman came up to me and said, "I have epilepsy." And I said, "I know, back in those days, epilepsy was considered an illness." And I said, "But one of the heroines in my book has epilepsy." And she was just floored. She said, "Nobody's ever done that before." And I said, "No, read it. The heroine has epilepsy, and you'll see her overcome the challenges, and she's the heroine in the book." So,
Do you talk about families, how families back then dealt with mental illness?
yes, there's the family will be on the kind of on the outside because I like to focus on the people with the illness. Uh, some families are very supportive and involved. Other families are not. And that is the way it has always been. So I allude to those different types of families throughout that. I've known such wonderful families in my work through the years, through the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, through the Mental Health America organization. I've worked with both of those organizations. I've known such wonderful people, and the families are, have had the struggle over the years.
And so fast forward to today, as you said, the families are usually on the fringe. Do you think families need to be brought more into the forefront of understanding more about what their family members are dealing with? Well, let me ask you first this. Do you see a rise today in mental illness compared to the periods that you were writing about?
It has always been there. The illness has always been there, but I think there's more of an awareness of the different types of illness we have. Now we're talking about young children with anxiety. We're talking about finally getting around to screening for them. And before, these people were just allowed to fail, and there's no reason they should fail. If given the right support, I think there's much more of an understanding of mental illness and of the various types of mental illness that we've had. I see families getting much more involved, much more organized, much more capable of affecting change. And that's just wonderful to see, because when I first started my career years and years ago, that just didn't happen. These people were just, shoved aside. They were not even allowed in many cases to be part of treatment. And of course, it's got to be. But it's wonderful to see that part of it, and people becoming more aware of all the different aspects of mental illness today.
So, Dorothea Dix and the asylum movement. Tell us more about how we could learn from Dorothy Dix. What period of time was that again? 19th
This
century?
is the mid 1800s when she started out, and she went from state to state, and she would walk through it. Of course, this is a time when women should not travel by themselves. She traveled by herself and counted the number of people that she found and who were mentally ill. And at this point, they were being locked up in cellars and wherever. And she would write up this incredible memorial to a state legislature and present it on the floor of the legislature, if she was allowed. Again, in New York, she wasn't even allowed. But at that point, again, 33 hospitals were created for people. And again, today, the word asylum has very negative connotations. But back then, an asylum was a place to keep the world out, not to keep these people in. It was a chance for them to have a clean, healthy environment, and they would be protected. Of course, we moved away from that a great deal. And as time goes by, the pendulum swings both ways. But it was the first time that she made people aware that mental illness was an illness. And she advocated for them to have a decent place to live and not to be abused. Her advocacy, the fact that she just stood up and said, no, this is not right. She used what skills she had. The skill that she had was writing. And if they wouldn't let her present it, she would find somebody else who did.
How brave during a time when women could not do anything, couldn't even own property. And here she
Exactly.
is advocating and and changing public policy and being a voice for a group of people who had no voice. And even today, as we look at, every prison in this country has a floor for the mentally ill.
Yes.
How far have we really come?
Yes. But again, she showed us all it takes is one. It takes each one of us to stand up. And I mean, if she could do this in 1850 when she, she wasn't even supposed to travel anywhere by herself. If she can do this, each one of us can do this. Her life is a textbook in how to be an advocate.
So these, and I think that's amazing and that's wonderful and that's encouraging. And I am so looking forward to reading this book. I'd never heard of this lady before till tonight. You're introducing me to a woman, a sister who's standing in the gap. So thank you very much. Um, when you look at what happened back then, and then look at, you say that mental illness is mental illness. The illness hasn't changed. Why do you think we're still, you said these people used to be just cast aside. Why do you think that we're still at this place of not accepting, we're accepting of other physical illnesses? Like, cancer used to be hush hush. We're accepting of physical illness. Why do you think, Jane, why do you think that we are still having a challenge accepting that there can be chemical imbalances in the brain?
I think it's an educational thing. You look at the way things are portrayed on TV and in movies, and I think it's an educational thing. And once you get to know these people who hear voices, and now we have all these other things that we've become aware of: the post-traumatic stress, the anxiety, the high suicide rate among our youth, our teenagers. Now that we're aware of this, I think there needs to be more education and talking about it. And once you get to know folks, you'll realize that they are just folks with a different kind of a problem.
Yeah. My heart, I've done work with NAMI over the years and talked to family members of my own. And, I've said once, if my eyeball was hanging out, everybody would be running to help me because they can see my eyeball hanging out.
Mm-hmm.
But when my soul is disturbed, when my mind is disturbed, because nobody can see that, I don't think that there's the urgency to come to the aid, which is why so many people with mental illnesses end up committing crimes. Mm-hmm. And then they're in the prison system.
Exactly. And we recognize, we can see these things building up. And even if you wanted to look at it from a purely fiscal point of view, how much money would it save society if we intervened early and prevented all of this from happening? It just would make sense to do that. And I really think that education and making it a topic that's not a scary topic, and which is a lot of what I wanted to do with my books. I wanted them to see the people as I saw them, people.
Yeah.
Just wonderful people who, are great musicians or who are very bright or who write beautiful poetry and just neat people, but they had an illness. And that's what I was hoping to do with my books.
Edgar Allan Poe. Yeah. And many, many others. You're a member of the Florida Writers Association and the Mental Health Writers Association. And what is the goal of the work that you all are doing, Jane?
Those folks help people like me who are not trained as writers, who came to writing probably later in life, even though we had written everything from grocery lists to legislation. But to get into that whole aspect of especially writing fiction, the Florida Writers Association, just wonderful. They give you all the support and encouragement uh, that you need to get started and to write. Writing's a very lonely kind of a thing. And the Mental Health Writers Association encourage people who are writing, especially in presenting the more positive aspect instead of the terrorist kind of things.
Well, what about helping people who have mental illnesses to be able to write and hear firsthand their voices and their challenges? Because, maybe there's some things that need to be done that we don't even know that need to be done if you're not in the thick of it.
Good point. We are seeing more and more people who are coming out and saying, "Yes, I have depression. Yes, I have schizophrenia in my family," and we're seeing more and more people coming out and doing that, and that would be wonderful to see more of them. Right. I've seen a lot more. Magazine, newspaper, op-ed kind of things too. But I suspect we're going to be seeing a lot more of the full-length novels as we go
Well,
along.
well, it'll be interesting to see what we hear about the fallout of this COVID um, pandemic that we've been in. And I saw an article that one doctor wrote that said the medical community is not prepared to handle the mind stress that COVID put on the world.
Exactly. We've seen that. We know that there's going to be a great deal. There's going to be a lot of repercussions from COVID. People were isolated. People lost their jobs. Their lives changed. We saw this, and we know that this is going to impact so many people. We don't have nearly the number of mental health professionals out there or the connections being made, although we're starting to use telemed, which is finally coming into its own. I think that would be beneficial. It's going to help more people. But again, there's no substitute for a person to person kind of thing. I'd like to see a lot more of the peer groups, um, just like the post traumatic stress. I don't think an outside counselor really can give as much credit or do as much for a group as someone who has been there. And I just see the veterans just doing wonderful things, the peer counseling and the peer groups. I would love to see more of that working.
Yeah, one person that I hope to be able to introduce you to is two-star Major General Martin, who is speaking out about mental illness and veterans. I hope to be able to connect you guys. Before we go, though, I want to hear about a witch's voice that was said in the 1600s.
Yes, it was the
So, so,
rise.
you, so interesting. The witch's voice and your connection with what happened with the witches and mental illness.
Well, it was the 1600s, the rise of witchcraft in London and Great Britain. We hear about the hospital, the St. Mary's of Bethlehem, which became Bedlam, and an opportunity to go there. Of course, the hospital isn't there anymore, but I saw the reincarnations, a couple of them. But these were a lot of the women who were accused of witchcraft were actually what we would call cunning women. They knew how to work with herbs, and everybody accused them of casting spells when really what they were doing was treating people with herbs. They were cunning women. They understood the use of words, but a lot of them were ones that were accused of witchcraft. And of course, the people who heard voices, they were accused of witchcraft as well. And again, this is the rise. This is Henry VIII. This is the rise of a lot of the political implications at that point as well.
You should write about midwifery and how that. And I'm not trying to tell you what you ought to write about, but it's interesting that women who were able to do healing kind of work were put in a category of witches,
Yes,
like women who midwives. It became illegal
exactly.
for a
They were
woman to help
cunning
another.
women.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The political aspect of all of this and how money drives it.
Yes, it did. And yet there were so many people who would go to these women for a cure, for help. And they were using just natural herbs, many of which we're still using today, by the way. Um, but yet they'd be the first accusers. It was great hypocrisy at that point, but they were the cunning women. And they really suspected them, probably because they had a lot of power, because they could cure a lot of things as well.
Jane, this is fascinating work. You've taken facts and history and blended it together to talk about a topic that we need to be talking about every day because people are suffering every day. Every day, the suicide rate is going up in this country.
Mm,
Children and veterans and other people who are deciding that they don't want to do this journey anymore.
mm.
So thank you for the works that you've done, the series of books that you've written called Voices,
The
and
Voices series, yes,
the Voices series, and Dorothea Dix,
yes.
and her movement, a one woman movement to change public policy and stand in the gap for those with mental illness. Jane, thank you so much.
And thank you, Pam. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about folks who are close to my heart.
Right. Thank you. Jane will be part of a group of writers who will be a part of the Sunshine State Book Festival, January 27th and 28th, 2023, at Trinity United Methodist Church, sponsored by the Gainesville Writers Alliance.
Mm.
I hope that you will be there so that you can talk to Jane and other authors in person and pick up these pieces of literature that will hopefully entertain. Some is entertaining, but in this case, change the lives and change the landscape of what we're seeing happening in the United States of America as it relates to mental illness. Thank you, Jane.
And thank you.
We will be here on Friday with more authors. I hope that you will join us. I will be back on Thursday for the Timbuktu Report. Please join us. If you are watching on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel. If you're watching on Facebook and LinkedIn, we appreciate your likes and your comments. I'm Pamela Marshall at the Wellness Radio TV and at the Wellness Radio TV podcast. Remember, there is healing at the well. Make it a fantastic moment. We'll see you next time.